Good morning. There's a lot I could say in terms of the pleasantries, but I'll skip them because while I have exorcised a lot of the traditional thinking that all of us have done to get to this place, I don't know how much of the Baptist preacher is still left in there. And so I only have 23 minutes. So let me go ahead and get to it. My name is Gary Green. I'm on the faculty at United Theological Seminary. I am in my last week of sabbatical, so I'm returning to work next week, and it's really good to be with you today. And today I want to speak from the topic, the Misunderstood Protagonist. And so, let me begin by saying that I've always been drawn to the plot. How stories unfold along a timeline of tension and release, and how they open us into resolutions that require us to act differently. I've always been drawn to plot and even more fascinated with scripts, the instructions that prompt an actor's performance. And maybe it's because I used to go with my mom to her theater rehearsals. And apparently, when I was a kid, I used to listen so intently that I would remember the lines and call them out when somebody would forget them. Or maybe I've always been an artist at heart, even before I became an athlete. Or in a real sense, even on the field, I felt like an artist. I can remember one of the most healing things that a teammate said to me long after our careers ended, and mine didn't end the way I hoped it would prior to. And he said, "Bro, you were a creative energy on the field, and coach didn't know what to do with you." And that resonated with the artistic part of my soul. This was also the reason that I wanted to write the book, Playing the Game, to give black athletes their just due, in the sense that we all embody a brilliance that we don't have necessarily a vernacular to articulate yet. I've always been drawn to plot, fascinated by scripts, and utterly intrigued by production as a whole. How our lives literally play out consequentially according to constructed rules in real time, and oftentimes without conscious awareness that we are playing parts in a production. This is why I love comedy so much. How black stand-up comedians in particular play the plot lines of life itself, exposing the silliness of the scripts we relate to so religiously. And they do it with such a surgical brilliance that we can often be just utterly confounded, which is why we laugh. It's a release. It's a release in knowing that all of this, when we're reminded that this is made up anyway. But it's because of this comedic sensibility that I've always been a little troubled by the religious plot lines that I grew up with, and the problematic ways I saw things play out as a young preacher. I can remember being in the office. I was an associate pastor in Lawrence, Kansas. I went to KU, so this was shortly after everything finished at KU. I was an associate pastor while a seminary student, and I would have conversations with the senior pastor. And we would talk about all these progressive, revolutionary, radical theological ideas, and he would talk about, it would sound like he really is thinking about these things, and then I would see him go to the pulpit and say the same stuff. But I also recognized the way that because he was beholden to the church. The deacons, the deaconesses, the money bag holders of the church. This was his bread and butter. So he felt like his hands were tied. He couldn't say what he really believed because of the tradition, because of the plot line we were caught up in. I wasn't paid by the church, and I was a seminary student. So I could say whatever the hell I wanted from the pulpit. And guess what? I am now a seminary professor, and I'm still not paid by the church. So I'd like to talk openly about one particular plot line that has always troubled me, and the scriptural fallout that has come as a result. It's the atonement plot line. And as you can see from the background, this atonement plot line can often make us act pretty erratically. See, most of us were born into a plot line that presumes we are the problem. This flesh is the problem. And this is a belief system that, as I said, this is all over the place in terms of how erratic this often makes us behave, because there's something about it that just doesn't register with the true reality of our bodies. And so in any plot or in any story, you typically 3 acts, and each act has some characteristics that I want to name. And so in any story, there's an opening image. This is the illustration of what the world is when you enter the story, right? But there's also a catalyst that kicks off the drama. Well, the opening image, according to this atonement plot line, is creation. God creates the world and everything is perfect. The inciting incident, the catalyst that kicks off the drama, well, humankind ruins the whole thing for everyone. And conveniently, it is uniquely a woman's fault. How convenient for patriarchal configurations that we're born into. And so the drama begins. You move to Act 2 of this plot line, and we're thrown into this kind of conflict and complication where the protagonist decides to pursue a goal. Israel pursues God and becomes a nation. But then the protagonist always suffers a setback, where Israel loses focus and the temple eventually is destroyed, and the cycle just keeps going and getting worse with every time. I've got in my notes devolve versus revolve, R in parentheses. So we can evolve or we can devolve, but either way, we're going in some direction. And I'm reminded of the book of Judges. This was my favorite book to read when I used to read the Bible. Yeah. Because Judges threw us into the tragedy of life, which I appreciate Scott talking about, this tension between tragedy and comedy. They're really 2 sides of the same story, which was why when you read the tragic in Judges, there's a lot of funny stories. One of the stories that I was drawn to in a sermon that I preached years ago called Samson's Suicide. And it was about the way that Samson begins in his homeland, and with each encounter, he goes down further and further on the map. And you look at the story, you can see there's this illustration of him going down further and further on the map until he ends up in the temple of Dagon, the heart of the enemy's headquarters and the symbolic center of his own temptations that he just can't get a handle on. And this is an illustration of the way that Israel, just especially from a Christian story told perspective, just can't get right. So a savior must be needed. So then we go to the plot twist as we enter Act 3 of this narrative. And this was supposed to be a gift. I don't know how to do technology sometimes. So it was supposed to be Thanos from Avengers saying, fine, I'll do it myself, and putting this glove on. And when I think about this traditional plot line, when I think about the plot twist of a child being born, and it's really like Thanos saying, fine, I'll do it myself, but instead of a golden glove, he wraps himself in human flesh and comes to do it himself, to save humanity from themselves in an eternal damnation, assuming, of course, that you pray that very particular prayer. Now, there's nuance here because, of course, there's never been a time in history where every Christian has treated their faith so flippantly. We know that there have always been Christianities, plural. But the loudest, most oppressive version is the one that we're talking about today. So we get this plot twist and we move toward the climax. And we know the climax, Calvary. The climax of every Easter sermon from here to heaven, a familial celebration of a crucifixion akin to the lynchings of the segregated South, and the irony of whole families showing up in suits to worship together. The setting might be different, but the dynamics are the same. One of the ways that I thought about this, how real this becomes, was, can you imagine Jesus' mother listening to your Easter sermon? Now, of course, the caveat is that we It's the resurrection that we are really celebrating, but a resurrection understood in such a way that further distinguishes us from our own divine capacity. I'll come back to that. But you come through the climax and you find yourself to the resolution. What is the resolution? The resolution is you pray that prayer. Romans 10:9, I can't remember how many times this passage of scripture was shoved down my throat when I was a kid. If you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. And we took it and ran with it, didn't we? Now you're as white as snow with coded language by the blood of a sacrificed lamb. Damn, would love do this? A loving father? And that's it. That's all you had to do. You don't really have to change your behavior. You can grab women by the pussy, peddle children across the world against the wills of agency that hasn't even fully developed, and play in our faces under the protection of a sacred office that you have desecrated, and still call yourself Christian. The real tragedy is that enough people believe it to make it a reality. The only thing that matters is that you claim Christianity, and even more so, apparently, that you claim it as the creator of this entire universe's only viable way to get to heaven. Come on. Come on. I can't be in Boston and not talk about Howard Thurman, who wrote a book called Jesus and the Disinherited, but I can't think about this sermon without talking about the way that Jesus is the disinherited when I think of this tradition. Jesus, the disinherited, the one that we stop listening to at some point. Jesus himself said the kingdom is within or among in an in-between sense, depending on how you interpret that word. Either way, it's not some pearly gated place one can just simply flippantly punch a ticket to. And don't be fooled by the use of dwelling places or mansions that Jesus says. It's a metaphor to convey the roomy comfort that being with God provides. What he was saying was much more relational than our capitalist predilections lend. Something is not adding up in this plot line. Or like when Jesus himself said, I am the way, the truth, and the life, he wasn't saying, I am the only way. That's not the point, despite how the next sentence has been taken to mean Christian exclusivism. No one comes to the Father except through or by me was delivered to a particular people in a particular context. And even then, through had more to do with a way of being, a way of embodying life, than a claim on himself as the exclusive object of worship. Jesus wasn't asking for our worship, he was inviting them to embody life as he did. Which is why he responded to Philip the way he did in the very next few sentences. We're talking about the disinherited Jesus. Lord, show us the Father. Philip, I have literally illustrated him for you. Demonstrated the divine right in front of your face. If you've seen me, you've seen God, because this is really just God acting through me, is basically what he said. And in case we need more proof, look at verse 12 of John 14, where he says, the one who believes in me will do the same things I've been doing and then some, because I am going back to the Father, and will do whatever you ask in my name, which presumes an intact agency even after death in relation to the source of all life, like an ancestor returning to consciousness with new information to be dispersed to everybody that's connected. Anybody seen Pluribus? I'm gonna just let that alone. But the plot thickens. What if Jesus' life was the punchline the whole time? Not his death and a resurrection misread. I remember when I was in a PhD program and Dr. Carrie Day introduced me to womanism. And one of the first books we read was Sisters in the Wilderness by Dolores Williams. And Dolores Williams basically talked about this surrogacy history where black women had uniquely been forced into a position of social surrogacy and literal surrogacy. And she likened it to the way that atonement theology thinks about Jesus, as this surrogate that is designed only to take the place of us to bear our sins, and that's it. And what Dolores Williams said was, there's no redemption in suffering. That is not the point. The point was his life and his teachings. The ministerial activity of Jesus was the point, right? And that he was crucified or lynched in a way that the state will do if you cause too many problems. And so when I was thinking about this, and this was basically my permission to think about God outside of this atonement plot line. And I'm like, wait, you mean I can look at Jesus kind of like I look at black athletes? Someone who perfected a craft in a full-bodied way through spiritual disciplines that enlist all of one's attention and energy? But then I got to reading about Dr. King a little further, and how Dr. Martin Luther King, in one of his PhD term papers, and the task was to decide, how do you understand the divinity and the humanity of Jesus? And where Dr. Martin Luther King landed on was that Jesus' God consciousness came through his utter devotion to love and to the will of God. Then I got to thinking about Howard Thurman. And when you read Jesus and the Disinherited, you will find that one of the phrases Howard Thurman uses to describe Jesus was a spiritual genius. That doesn't sound like just some cosmic cheat code that Jesus had no real part to play in. A spiritual genius? What might we learn from the mindset of a Messiah if we reread this through this lens? And so one of the ways that I've learned, or that I'm playing with to define what Christ consciousness is that Jesus essentially closed the gap between devotion and delusion. We don't talk enough about how delusional Jesus was. I'm going to just let that sit for a second. People question him all the time about it too. Who the hell do you think you are? I am. And being called crazy didn't stop him from conjuring the life God wants all of us to live. Because belief is a hell of a drug. One of the things that I talk about in Playing the Game is how belief, and there's this neuroscience term called, or concept talked about, the reticular activation system. Basically, it's a feature of our embodiment, of the brilliance of our bodies, where when you believe something, your brain will naturally go into this mode where it filters out all evidence to the contrary. And it will make you continually look at life through the lens of your own belief, right? But it's not just an intellectual faculty, it's embodied too. There's a study where hotel women are compared. There's a control group, which in this group, they are not giving any information about the CDC standards for daily exercise. In the experimental group, they are told that basically what they're doing every day at work exceeds the recommended amount of daily exercise. And they measured both groups over 4 weeks. Their control, there was no outside activity, no extra working out. Didn't nobody go get a gym membership in the meantime. It was just what you do at work. When they compared the groups after 4 weeks, the group that was made to believe that they were doing exercise, BMI went down, body weight went down, hip to waist ratio went down, internal measures of health went up. But the group that didn't have that belief essentially stayed the same. There's a magic that we're not talking about. Jesus was essentially possessed by love itself, by God, and as a result perfected the life of its power. Because everything can become inspiration when your mind is attuned as such. But we're not told this story. We need new plot lines. And so I want to put forth this post-Christian plot line, if you will, where we move from atonement to attunement. Now, think about the word atonement. It means at one-ment, to be put at one with something, based on the assumption that we've been separated. But attunement doesn't assume such separation because the reality is we were never disconnected from God. And we can attune back into the divine anytime we want. And so if I was to retell this story through an attunement plot line, well, then with the opening image would just be a little different. It's still creation, but it's also recreation, recreation, where God creates the world and everything is not perfect, it's perfecting. He begins a process. They begin a process. She begins a process. The divine puts us into a process that is unfolding in a way that tracks when you think about our evolutionary biology. God creates the world and everything is perfecting. Humankind is created in God's likeness and commissioned to continue the process of recreation. Now, I'm using recreation on purpose because have you ever thought about the other word for play? And the fact that I said earlier, all this is made up anyway. We're playing out plot lines into reality in real space-time. We are created in the divine image. But so then what is the inciting incident that kicks off the drama that we know ourselves to be living in relation to? Shame. And this I got from my homie, Dr. T. Because I wasn't planning on talking about sin or even thinking about sin anymore until I listened to a podcast interview where Tamis was talking about how sin attaches to shame. And so then I went back to the story of Cain and Abel and recognized that Cain does in fact act out of shame because God did not look as highly on his half-assed sacrifice as God did on the full fattiness of Abel's offering. And if you look at the text, the words are specific. Abel gives the fat portions of the firstborn, the best of what he had. Cain, in the course of time or after the fact, offers his offering and then acts out of shame, right? Sin attaches to shame. Fetishizing our finitude can often make us forget our capacity for the infinite within us. We've been given control over our lives that we live, including whether or not we act out of shame or act out of guilt or these are things that we will experience, but we don't have to act from them. Or other felt failings that make us susceptible to the seductions of sin. And so if we're moving then from Act 1 to Act 2, what is the task that we've been given? To perfect the craft of recreating the world God imagines. And the tension is that the only instruction is intuition in a field of energetic intimacy. What I mean by that is that we can't escape the fact that we affect each other deeply. Right? And of course, we've made up, morality and rules and everything by which we govern ourselves. But really, when it began, the only instruction was intuition. Y'all got to figure this out in real time is what God is commissioning us to do. But intuition is really all we need to know what does God imagine. But only if you're attuned. And so then what is the plot twist? Well, if we take seriously the fact that our flesh is not the problem, that our bodies are part and parcel of the divine mission, then when I think about the fact that we're made in the image of likeness of God, the imago Dei for me turns to imago DNA. We are divine organisms. Sensuality is the substrate of spiritual life. Our bodies emit, and we talk about this all the time, frequencies and vibes and blah, blah, blah. It's real. We emit the frequencies that we call spirits, or sprits, as I like to play on. We give off a spritz with everything that we do and what we say. And then in turn, these are the things that we inspire from each other. This is how it goes. So then what is the climax? It's kind of anticlimactic. Every interaction in real time is a climax. Every exchange that we have with another person, every exchange we have with any life, every exchange we have with a plant is consequential and a potential climax. So then what is the resolution? The resolution is root work. We are the outgrowth of God in a very literal sense. Learning to attune in order to train our attention toward incarnating life. We are called to conjure within ourselves the ingredients for incarnational life because we are the embodiment of God. And so what are the ingredients of incarnational life? Well, one is inspiration. And inspiration for me, I think about, so here's an illustration. And one of the scenes that I illustrate in the book, in Playing the Game, is, I don't know how many of you all are football fans. I don't know how many of you all remember the quote-unquote Beastquake run that Marshawn Lynch had years ago against the New Orleans Saints, right? Think about what happened in that stadium when that run happened. One, the nearby Richter scales measured it as an earthquake. And it held the record until a Taylor Swift concert years later, and I was just like, damn it, I wanted him to have the record. But think about the inspiration that came off of that event. How it did something to people that were in the stadium. Or think about the inspiration that you felt since we've been at this conference. Where did it come from? Somebody said something? You had a conversation that did something to you energetically, that inspired you, which is different from motivation. You can be motivated by a job that you hate, but inspiration works underneath the surface, right? But we don't talk enough about how inspiration it's like a daily exchange. Your loved ones inspire you to get up and live your life every day. This is why God said it's not good for us to be alone. Because we exchange, we feed off of each other for life, giving and getting life from the ways that we embody it together. And it is a constant exchange. But then also there's intelligence. Something that I really want to deal with is the fact that neurotypicality is a myth. That all of our minds work different by design as iterations of the same divine energy, figuring this thing out in real time. That you actually are an intelligence. So don't be fooled by the IQ test. This was a measure that was created for a particular purpose. If we're being honest about it, the fact that you're here illustrates that you are an intelligence. Because intelligence is inherently creative energy, finding its way through these barriers, finding expression. But then there's imagination. The fact that we can bring things from fantasy to reality, and that this fantastical realm exists within us, and it is touched by the inspiration of other people, so that these ideas are born, they're planted in our soil, and then they germinate, and all of a sudden we can bring forth reality in real time. One of my favorites is integrity, because we talk a lot about authenticity, the frequency of authenticity, and that's true. But integrity is the physics of integrity undergirds the frequency of authenticity. A bodily system working in an integrity kind of way is what gives the feeling of authenticity. So when you're not having to hide something, or when you're not forced to be closeted, or when you can be yourself, then all of a sudden you can feel when somebody else is moving in this way. It's integrity before it becomes authenticity. How do we conjure integrity? But then finally, intention. This was an interesting one because, intention, it implies inspiration and direction. It's like the power of focused energy, especially when we understand that energy is divine. But when I was looking at each of these words, and I've been for full disclosure, the next book I'm gonna be working on is dealing with this idea of root work and thinking about these ingredients for incarnational life. And I nerd out to words. I look up etymology. I look up synonyms and antonyms and definitions because I want to understand why are we articulating things in these ways. And funny, intention was the only one among these that does not have an antonym, which means that because there's always an intention operative, even if you don't know what it is. Your energy is always up to something, even if you're unclear about what it is. So who is the protagonist? We all are. Thank you.